Before we open the vault of humanity's worst ideas, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the Resident Evil lore deep dives. This is the complete breakdown of every B.O.W. project that spiraled out of control, from failed super soldiers to living weapons that turned on their creators and nearly ended the world. Part 1, Progenitor, the failure that started everything. To understand the systemic collapse of every biological weapon project that followed, one must first analyze the fundamental instability of the Progenitor Virus itself. Discovered in 1966 within the petals of the Sonnentrepper flower, deep in the Ndipaya ruins, this ancient RNA retrovirus was heralded by Oswell E. Spencer and James Marcus as the ultimate catalyst for forced human evolution. However, from a tactical and scientific standpoint, the Progenitor Virus was the first and most significant failure of the Umbrella Corporation. The primary reason for this failure was a staggering and near-total lack of genetic compatibility with the modern human genome. The virus was an apex predator of the microscopic world, designed to rebuild its host from the cellular level upward. But it required an internal iron constitution that simply did not exist in the vast majority of the population. Statistically, the compatibility rate was estimated at a pathetic 1 in 10 million, a figure that rendered the virus useless as a mass production weapon or a tool for global change. When the Progenitor Virus was introduced to a non-compatible host, the results were not evolutionary, but catastrophic. Instead of the refined physical and mental ascension that Spencer dreamed of, the virus triggered massive and uncontrollable mutations that tore the host apart from the inside out. The viral RNA would invade the cells and initiate a hyper-accelerated metabolic state, causing the body to burn through its own resources in a matter of hours. The sorrow of these early experiments was found in the sheer volume of corpses that littered the hidden laboratories of the 1960s. Most hosts died long before any significant data could be gathered, their organs failing as their genetic code was rewritten into a nonsensical and lethal script. For those few who did not die immediately, the virus provided only a mindless and horrific monstrosity, stripping away all cognitive function and leaving behind a hollow shell, driven by a primal and self-destructive hunger. This constant and fatal failure rate was the original sin of Umbrella. It proved that nature could not be forced to cooperate with the aristocratic whims of men like Spencer. The sheer unpredictability of the Progenitor Virus forced Marcus and his team to search for a way to tame the infection, leading to the creation of the more stable but ultimately more famous T-virus. They realized that they could not weaponize the Progenitor Virus in its raw state because it was too efficient at killing its host. A weapon that destroys its wielder as often as its target is not a weapon at all. It is a liability. The history of the Progenitor Virus is a record of thousands of statistical failures that were discarded into the incinerators of the Spencer estate. It was a failure of arrogance, the belief that 1,000 years of noble breeding could prepare a man for the raw, ancient power of a virus that had existed since the dawn of time. Every horror that followed, from the mansion to the streets of Raccoon City, was a desperate attempt to fix the biological dead end that was the Progenitor Virus. Part 2, Alpha Hunters. Early combat experiments. As the search for a manageable biological weapon intensified, the focus shifted from pure evolution to the creation of specialized combat units. This led to the Alpha Hunter project, one of the earliest and most ambitious attempts to engineer a creature specifically for the battlefield. The scientific logic behind the hunter was to combine the genetic strengths of different species through the medium of the T-virus. by splicing human DNA with reptilian genetic material. Umbrella hoped to create a soldier that possessed the strength and resilience of a cold-blooded predator while maintaining the tactical utility of a human being. On paper, the project was a masterpiece of iron engineering, but in practice, it was a spectacular failure of intelligence control. The Alpha Hunters were indeed physically superior to any human soldier, possessing incredible speed, armor-plated skin, and the iconic guillotine claws that could decapitate an opponent in a single swipe. But they were mentally broken from the moment of their birth. The primary failure of the Alpha Hunter was its uncontrollable aggression. The reptilian DNA, when stimulated by the T virus, effectively overwrote the higher cognitive functions of the human host. The result was a creature that lived in a state of permanent, high-intensity predatory instinct. While Umbrella wanted a soldier that could follow complex mission parameters and work alongside human units, they instead created a monster that viewed every living thing as a target. The Alpha Hunters lacked the necessary neural architecture to distinguish between a handler and a victim. They were known to attack their own creators with the same ferocity they showed toward an enemy, making them a logistical nightmare for any military commander. This lack of intelligence meant that they could not be deployed in any environment that required precision or discretion. They were blunt instruments of slaughter, capable of clearing a room, but incapable of securing an objective. Furthermore, the Alpha Hunter project highlighted the inherent instability of interspecies splicing. The sorrow of the project was the high rate of physical deformity and sudden cellular collapse among the early test subjects. Many of the creatures were born with incomplete nervous systems or limbs that were incapable of supporting their own weight, leading to a massive waste of resources and research time. Even the successful units required constant sedation and specialized containment that made their actual field deployment a near impossibility. Umbrella had succeeded in creating a terrifying killer, but they had failed to create a weapon that could be controlled. This failure forced the company to realize that iron physical strength was useless without the iron of mental discipline. The Alpha Hunters remained a terrifying reminder that when you play with the building blocks of life, the results are rarely as obedient as you expect them to be. They were a biological dead end that proved that the gap between a predator and a soldier was wider than the T virus could bridge. Part 3. Cerberus Program. The Cerberus Program represented a different approach to biological weaponry, one based on the iron pragmatism of utilizing existing military assets. Instead of trying to create a new creature from scratch, Umbrella's researchers decided to enhance a species that had already been trained for combat, the dog. Specifically, they utilized the Doberman Pinscher, a breed known for its intelligence, loyalty, and aggression. By injecting these dogs with a refined strain of the T virus, Umbrella hoped to create a cheap and easily deployable B.O.W. that could function as a high-speed scout and attack unit. On a physical level, the Cerberus was an immediate success. The virus granted the animals superhuman strength, an almost supernatural resistance to pain, and a terrifying increase in jaw pressure. However, the Cerberus program would eventually become the primary catalyst for the sorrow of the Raccoon City outbreak, due to a complete failure in containment and biological security. The ultimate failure of the Cerberus program was not in the creature's performance, but in its role as a viral vector. Because the dogs were designed for mobility and outdoor deployment, they were far more difficult to contain than the more static experiments kept in the deeper levels of the Arclay laboratory. During the initial internal leak in the Spencer mansion, the Cerberus units were among the first to escape the facility. Their enhanced speed allowed them to bypass the mansion's perimeter security and vanish into the surrounding forest. Once in the wild, they became highly efficient spreaders of the T virus, preying on local wildlife and hikers. This created a shadow outbreak in the mountains that the authorities were completely unprepared for. The Cerberus units were the primary cause of the strange disappearances and cannibal attacks that eventually drew the STARS team to the mansion, effectively leading the very people who could expose Umbrella directly to the scene of the crime. Additionally, the Cerberus program proved that the T virus destroyed the very loyalty that made the Doberman a useful military asset. Once infected, the dogs lost all of their previous training and became driven purely by a viral hunger. They were no longer soldiers. They were highly mobile biohazards. This lack of control meant that they were just as likely to infect a friendly city as they were to attack an enemy base. The Cerberus units eventually reached the outskirts of Raccoon City, where they contributed to the contamination of the water supply and the initial spread of the infection among the human population. They were a tactical disaster masquerading as an efficient weapon. Umbrella had focused so much on the iron of the dog's physical bite that they ignored the sorrow of the dog's biological instability. The Cerberus program stands as a warning that in the world of B.O.W. development, the most mobile weapons are often the most dangerous to the ones who build them. Part 4. Tyrant T-002, Spencer Mansion. The T-002 Tyrant was intended to be the definitive answer to the failures of the Hunter and Cerberus programs. It was the second functional prototype of the Tyrant series, a pinnacle of iron bioengineering that utilized a highly compatible human host and a specialized strain of the T virus. The goal of the project was to create the ultimate life form, a biological soldier that possessed superhuman strength, a high degree of intelligence, and the ability to follow complex combat orders. For decades, Umbrella's scientists had chased the dream of the Tyrant, and the T-002 was the closest they had ever come to achieving it. Stored in the deepest, most secure laboratory beneath the Spencer Mansion, the T-002 was a towering monument to corporate arrogance. However, when the creature was finally activated during the Mansion incident of 1998, it revealed a fatal flaw that would define the entire Tyrant line: the total absence of loyalty and the loss of cognitive restraint. The T-002 possessed a level of physical power that was truly terrifying. It could shrug off small arms fire as if it were nothing more than a nuisance and could move with a speed that defied its massive size. Its primary weapon, a massive and mutated claw, was capable of tearing through reinforced steel. But as soon as the creature was released from its stasis tank, the sorrow of the project became clear. The T-002 did not view Albert Wesker or the Umbrella researchers as its masters. It viewed them as the first obstacles to be removed. The virus had succeeded in enhancing the host's body, but it had utterly failed in preserving any sense of obedience. The T-002 was a creature of pure, unfiltered aggression that lacked the capacity for non-combat thought. It did not care about mission parameters or corporate objectives. It cared only about the destruction of any living thing in its immediate vicinity. The final failure of the T-002 was proven when it was engaged and destroyed by the survivors of the STARS Alpha team. Despite its perfect strength, the creature was unable to adapt to the tactical brilliance of highly trained human opponents. It relied purely on brute force, making it predictable and ultimately vulnerable to a well-aimed rocket launcher. This highlighted a fundamental paradox in Umbrella's research. You cannot create a perfect soldier by removing the very human traits, like tactical flexibility and cooperation, that make a soldier effective. The T-02 was a magnificent biological machine, but it was a machine with a broken steering wheel. Its destruction at the Spencer Mansion was the proof that perfect strength without control was a death sentence for the project. Umbrella had built a god that was too stupid to survive a gunfight, a failure of vision that would haunt the company as they moved toward mass production. Part 5. Tyrant T-103, Mr. X series. Following the embarrassing failure of the T-002 at the Spencer Mansion, Umbrella's researchers realized that they needed to prioritize control over raw power. This led to the development of the T-103 series, often referred to as the Mr. X series, which was the first Tyrant model intended for mass production. These units were cloned from a single, highly compatible host and were equipped with a power limiter in the form of a reinforced trench coat that kept their mutations in check and allowed them to blend in, to some degree, with a chaotic environment. The T-103 was designed to be a more refined and obedient tool of the iron corporate will. Unlike its predecessor, the T-103 could follow specific and complex mission parameters, such as the retrieval of the G virus sample or the elimination of witnesses in the Raccoon City Police Department. However, the T-103 project would eventually fail due to its own single-mindedness and its inability to handle high-intensity combat stress without losing its human form. The primary success of the Mr. J X series was its ability to follow orders, which made it far more useful than the wild and unpredictable T-002. It was a cold, silent, and relentless pursuer that could move through a city with a singular focus on its target. But this focus was also its greatest weakness. The T-103 lacked the tactical creativity required to deal with intelligent and resourceful opponents like Leon S. Kennedy or Claire Redfield. It relied almost entirely on brute force and a slow, methodical advance, making it relatively easy to outmaneuver in a complex urban environment. The sorrow of the Mr. X series was found in its biological breaking point. When a T-103 unit sustained enough physical damage, its power limiter would fail, and the creature would undergo a super tyrant mutation. While this granted the creature even greater strength, it also caused it to lose all of its cognitive functions and mission focus, reverting back to the same mindless aggression that had doomed the T-002. Ultimately, the T-103 series was a mass production disaster because it failed to provide a stable, long-term solution for a controllable biological soldier. Once the mutation was triggered, the unit was essentially lost to the command structure. It became a liability that was just as likely to destroy Umbrella's own assets as it was to kill the enemy. The deployment of multiple T-103 units during the Raccoon City outbreak resulted in a high loss rate and very little actual progress toward Umbrella's goals. They were easily outclassed by the rapid evolution of the G virus and the tactical ingenuity of the survivors. The Mr. X series proved that mass-producing a flawed design only results in more frequent failures. Umbrella had focused on the iron of obedience, but had failed to solve the sorrow of biological instability. They had created a better slave, but they had not yet created a god that could survive the chaos of a real battlefield. Part 6. Nemesis T-Type. The Nemesis T-Type was intended to be the ultimate synthesis of biological power and artificial control, the definitive answer to the cognitive failures of every tyrant that came before it. Developed by Umbrella's European branch in the late 1990s, the Nemesis was not just a viral experiment. It was a parasitic integration project that represented the pinnacle of the iron corporate ambition. The core of the Nemesis project was the NE alpha parasite, a biologically engineered organism designed to burrow into the brain of a T-103 tyrant host and take total command of its central nervous system. This was supposed to solve the sorrow of tyrant stupidity by providing a secondary intelligence that could process complex tactical information, recognize specific targets, and even utilize advanced weaponry like rocket launchers. However, the Nemesis T-type would eventually prove that adding more biological complexity only creates more spectacular points of failure. On a physical level, the Nemesis was a terrifying success during its initial deployment in Raccoon City. It exhibited a level of persistence and tactical awareness that was previously unheard of in a bioorganic weapon. It could track its primary targets, the surviving members of the STARS unit, across the entire city, bypassing obstacles and adapting to changing environments with chilling efficiency. The iron of the parasite allowed the creature to maintain its mission focus even when under heavy fire. But the fatal flaw of the Nemesis project lay in its stress response and the inherent instability of the parasite-host relationship. When the Nemesis sustained extreme physical trauma or was pushed to its metabolic limits, the Na-alpha parasite would begin to lose its delicate grip on the host's physiology. Instead of maintaining control, the parasite would trigger a series of rapid, runaway mutations as a desperate survival mechanism, transforming the creature into a monstrous and unrecognizable mass of flesh. The final failure of the Nemesis was witnessed during its final confrontation with Jill Valentine. After multiple defeats and massive structural damage, the parasite essentially overclocked the host body, causing it to shed its humanoid form and mutate into a giant, formless beast that was driven purely by instinct. In this state, the Nemesis was no longer a sophisticated soldier. It was a mindless biological hazard that had lost all ability to follow its original kill stars directive. The high cost of its development and the specialized nature of its parasitic control made it impossible to mass produce, and its ultimate collapse proved that even the most advanced biological iron could be broken by the stress of a determined human opponent. Umbrella had spent billions of dollars to create a hunter that ultimately became a heap of mutated meat. A failure of complexity that proved that you cannot force a parasite to maintain its sanity in the heat of a real war. Part 7. Hunters. The Hunter Project was one of Umbrella's most persistent attempts to create a specialized, low-cost infantry unit that could be deployed in a variety of environments. By continuing to refine the initial Alpha Hunter data, the company eventually produced several variants, including the Beta and Gamma models. These creatures were the result of the iron belief that reptile and amphibian DNA could be perfectly harmonized with the human genome through the T virus. The hunters were designed to be agile, powerful, and intelligent enough to work in packs, making them the iron backbone of Umbrella's early bioorganic weapon catalog. However, the entire hunter lineage would eventually be categorized as a biological dead end, because the very intelligence that made them effective also made them completely uncontrollable in any scenario involving civilian populations or tactical restraint. The primary failure of the hunter variants was their inability to be integrated into a standard military command structure. While they were intelligent enough to flank targets and utilize their environment for ambushes, they lacked the cognitive capacity for anything other than predatory slaughter. The sorrow of the project was that a hunter could never be told not to kill. They were hyper-aggressive carnivores that viewed any moving object as prey, which meant they could not be used in peacekeeping missions, urban occupations, or any operation that required a distinction between combatants and non-combatants. This limited their marketability to only the most scorched earth military operations, a narrow niche that did not justify the immense research and development costs. Furthermore, variants like the Hunter Gamma, which utilized amphibian DNA, were limited by their extreme environmental requirements. They were lethal in the water, but could not survive for long in dry or urban environments, making them tactically inflexible. Ultimately, the hunters remained a terrifying obstacle for survivors, like Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. But they were a failure as a sustainable military product. They were too violent to be managed and too specialized to be universal. The iconic guillotine claw attack, while effective at decapitating human targets, was a symptom of a creature that only knew how to destroy. Umbrella had succeeded in creating a perfect reptilian killer, but they had failed to create a soldier that could be trusted to hold a position or secure a facility without eating the staff. The Hunter Project was a lesson in the dangers of over-engineering aggression. By the time the company realized they had created a monster they couldn't turn off, the world was already moving toward more sophisticated and manageable biological threats. Part 8. Chimera Project. The Chimera Project was one of the most horrific and misguided experiments to emerge from the Spencer Mansion laboratories. It was the result of the iron curiosity of researchers who sought to bridge the gap between human physiology and the structural advantages of insectoid life. By splicing human DNA with that of the common housefly and subjecting the result to the T virus, Umbrella created a multi-limbed, exoskeleton-clad nightmare that was designed to navigate the tight and inaccessible spaces of an industrial environment. On a purely biological level, the Chimera was an efficient predator, possessing the ability to crawl along ceilings and drop onto unsuspecting victims from the shadows. However, from a tactical and logistical perspective, the Chimera was an utter and complete failure that served as a cautionary tale of over-specialization. The fatal flaw of the Chimera was its extreme and debilitating reliance on specific environmental features. Because of its insectoid biology and the way its limbs were structured, the creature was essentially useless in any environment that did not have overhead structures, ventilation shafts, or low ceilings. It lacked the balance and the muscular configuration for effective combat in open fields, forests, or even wide urban streets. This made it a tactical dead end that could only be used in very specific, cramped interior locations. The sorrow of the project was that Umbrella had spent vast resources on a creature that was essentially a high-maintenance pest. Its intelligence was minimal, its aggression was erratic, and its physical instability made it prone to sudden cellular death if the environmental temperature shifted even a few degrees. In the end, the Chimera was nothing more than a localized horror that haunted the boiler rooms and vents of the Arklay Research Center. It contributed nothing to the advancement of the Tyrant or Hunter programs, and was eventually abandoned as a viable bioorganic weapon candidate. It was a failure of imagination, a project that focused so much on the iron utility of the insect form that it ignored the practical realities of modern warfare. The Chimera proved that just because a creature is horrifying to look at does not mean it is an effective weapon. It was a biological mistake that was buried alongside the rest of the Spencer Mansion's secrets, a multi-limbed monument to the scientific arrogance that believed any mutation was a step forward. Part 9. Plant 42 and Biobotany Weapons. The accidental creation of Plant 42 in the Arklay guardhouse was a significant moment in Umbrella's history, as it opened the door to the iron possibility of biobotany weapons. When the T virus leaked into the facility's water supply, it interacted with a common plant specimen, causing it to grow to a massive size and develop a crude form of predatory sentience. Plant 42 was capable of using its vines to capture and drain the blood from any human or animal that wandered into its territory. This led some researchers to believe that vegetation could be weaponized to create static defense systems that required no maintenance or food other than local intruders. However, the reality of Plant 42 proved that botanical weapons were plagued by the same sorrow as their animal counterparts: a total lack of mobility and an extreme vulnerability to simple countermeasures. The primary failure of Plant 42 was its total lack of tactical flexibility. Because it was a rooted organism, it could be easily avoided once its location was known. It was a passive threat that could only kill those who were foolish enough to enter its direct vicinity. This made it useless for any offensive operation or for the securing of a dynamic battlefield. Furthermore, its reliance on the local water and nutrient supply meant that it was extremely vulnerable to environmental sabotage. The sorrow of the plant was how easily it could be defeated by anyone with a basic knowledge of chemistry. The development of the V-Jolt herbicide proved that even a massive and sentient viral plant could be killed at the roots with a simple chemical mixture. Additionally, like all biological matter, Plant 42 was highly susceptible to fire, making it a liability in a world where flamethrowers and incendiary grenades are standard military tools. While Plant 42 provided valuable data on how the T-virus could affect plant life, it ultimately showed that biobotany was an iron dead end. The costs of cultivating and protecting such a large and static organism far outweighed its utility as a weapon. Umbrella would eventually move away from large-scale botanical weapons, focusing instead on mobile organisms that could carry the virus to the target. Plant 42 remained a rotting curiosity in the guardhouse, a failure of biology that proved that even the most aggressive weeds could be pulled if you had the right poison. It was a reminder that evolution is not always an improvement. Sometimes it is just a larger target. Part 10. Lisa Trevor. The tragedy of Lisa Trevor is perhaps the most profound sorrow in the entire history of the Umbrella Corporation, representing the total collapse of ethics in the pursuit of the Iron Dream. Lisa was the daughter of George Trevor, the architect who designed the Spencer Mansion, and in 1967 she was abducted alongside her mother to serve as the first human test subjects for the Progenitor Virus. For over 30 years, Lisa was kept in total isolation within the mansion's hidden laboratories, subjected to a continuous and horrific cycle of viral injections, including the progenitor, the T-virus, and even the experimental parasite that would later lead to the discovery of the G-virus. Lisa was the iron proof that the human body could endure unimaginable levels of viral stress, but she was also the ultimate failure as a bioorganic weapon because she lost every shred of her humanity in the process. Lisa Trevor's biological success was her near-total immortality. Her body had integrated so many different viral strains that it had become a self-repairing and hyper-resilient mass of mutated tissue. She could survive gunshots, falls from great heights, and even decades of physical abuse without dying. However, this immortality came at the cost of her sanity and her soul, a logical anomaly that Umbrella's researchers eventually came to fear and despise. The final failure of the Lisa Trevor project was the realized terrifying legend that served as a constant reminder of the company's original sin. Her eventual destruction during the mansion incident was an act of mercy for a creature that had been denied death for over 3 decades. Lisa Trevor was the living proof that when you treat the human spirit as a variable in a biological equation, you end up with a monster that no amount of iron can control. She was the ultimate failure of the Spencer era, a tragic monument to the cost of godhood. Part 11. Marcus Leach, Queen. The resurrection of James Marcus through the medium of the T virus and a colony of genetically engineered leeches represents one of the most unique and terrifying failures in the history of the Umbrella Corporation. James Marcus was one of the 3 original founders of the company and the primary architect of the T virus, but his death at the hands of Albert Wesker and William Birkin in 1988 was supposed to be the end of his influence. However, the iron persistence of his research proved to be his ultimate undoing and his eventual salvation. For 10 years, his corpse lay in the darkness of the facility sewers, where a queen leech infected with a highly refined strain of the virus entered his body. This was not a simple reanimation of dead tissue. It was a total biological fusion between a human host and a hive mind colony. By 1998, the entity known as the Queen Leech had absorbed Marcus's memories and his hatred, resulting in a creature that possessed the iron intellect of a genius and the sorrow of a vengeful ghost. The primary failure of the Marcus Leech Queen project was the absolute loss of human identity and the creation of a force that was fundamentally incompatible with corporate control. While the creature could mimic the appearance of a young James Marcus, it was in reality a collection of thousands of individual leeches acting as a single organism. This biological structure granted the Queen Leech incredible regenerative abilities and the power to control other infected organisms, but it also made the entity entirely unstable. As a bio-organic weapon, the Queen Leech was a catastrophic failure because its primary motivation was the total destruction of the Umbrella Corporation. It did not seek to advance the science of the virus. It sought to burn the world that had betrayed its host. This highlights the recurring theme in Umbrella's history, where the iron will of the creator is eventually turned against them by the very creatures they birthed in the dark. The final failure was proven during the events at the Executive Training Center. Despite her massive power and her ability to control the viral spread, she was unable to withstand the combined tactical efforts of Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen. The biological sorrow of the Queen Leech was her vulnerability to sunlight and high-intensity heat, which proved that even the most advanced viral regeneration has a physical breaking point. The entity was a biological dead end because it required a specific and irreproducible set of circumstances to exist. It was a one-of-a-kind anomaly that could never be mass-produced or utilized as a reliable weapon of war. James Marcus had succeeded in cheating death, but he had done so by becoming a monster that could only exist in the shadows. His destruction was the final nail in the coffin of the original Founders era, proving that a hive mind driven by revenge is a weapon that will always strike the hand that holds it. Part 12. Ashford Experiments, Alexia. The Ashford family history is a record of aristocratic pride and genetic obsession that eventually led to the catastrophic failure of the T. Veronica project. Alexia Ashford, the granddaughter of company founder Edward Ashford, was a child prodigy who viewed the human race with the same iron contempt as Oswell E. Spencer. She believed that the key to true godhood lay in the social structure of insects, specifically the absolute hierarchy of the ant colony. By combining the Progenitor Virus with ant DNA and a variety of plant genes, she created the T. Veronica virus. To solve the problem of rapid cellular rejection, she injected herself and entered a 15-year period of cryogenic stasis to allow her body to slowly adapt to the viral invasion. This was an act of extreme iron discipline, but it resulted in a biological failure that was so absolute it threatened to consume the entire planet. The failure of the Alexia Ashford experiment was the creation of a being that could not coexist with any other form of life. Alexia did not want to lead humanity. She wanted to replace the entire global biosphere with her own hive mind. As she emerged from her stasis in the Antarctic facility, she exhibited the power to control fire and to generate massive tentacles that could crush entire buildings. However, she was a tactical disaster because she viewed everything as a subordinate or a threat. There was no room for partners or allies in the world of the T. Veronica Queen. This made her a sorrow for the Umbrella Corporation because she was a weapon that could not be pointed at an enemy without destroying the user as well. Her biology was so aggressive and so transformative that it would have eventually led to the collapse of the very infrastructure she needed to rule. Her ultimate destruction by Chris Redfield and Albert Wesker proved that even a hive mind queen was susceptible to the iron of human ingenuity and specialized weaponry like the linear launcher. Alexia had sacrificed her family, her sanity, and 15 years of her life to achieve a state of perfection that was defeated in a single afternoon. The T. Veronica project was a dead end because it was built on the flawed logic that a single individual could manage a global ecosystem of mutation. It was the ultimate expression of Ashford arrogance, a project that produced a beautiful and terrifying monster that had no place in a world of men. Alexia Ashford was a failure because she forgot that a queen without a kingdom is merely a target, and her death in the frozen wastes of Antarctica marked the end of the Ashford dream of viral nobility. Part 13. Las Plagas Pre-Sadler Control. The discovery of the Las Plagas parasites in a remote region of Spain represented a radical shift away from viral engineering and toward the iron utility of parasitic mind control. Unlike the T virus, which often destroyed the cognitive functions of the host, the Plaga parasite was designed to live in a symbiotic relationship with the human nervous system. In its ancient and unrefined state, the Plaga would create ganados, which were humans that retained their basic intelligence and motor skills, but lost their individual will to the parasite. This was the iron dream of any military commander, an army that could use tools, communicate and follow orders without hesitation. However, the early history of the Plagas was a record of total loss of control, because the parasites were originally hyper-aggressive and lacked a centralized command structure. The failure of the pre-Sadler Plagas was their inherent rebellion and the lack of a dominant species to govern the swarm. Without a leader, the infected ganados were little more than a violent mob that destroyed their own villages and resources. They lacked the tactical cohesion required for a modern bioorganic weapon, and were prone to sudden and unpredictable mutations that would kill the host. The sorrow of the early Plaga research was the realization that a parasite without a leash is just as dangerous to the community as a virus. The local population was consumed by the infection, and the parasites were eventually sealed away beneath the castle of the Salazar family, because they were too unstable to be utilized. It was only through the intervention of the Los Iluminados cult that a way to tame the parasites was discovered, but even then, the failure of control remained a constant threat. The Plagas represent a biological dead end for those who seek absolute power, because the parasite always has its own agenda. Even with the later advancements, the basic Plaga units remained susceptible to high-intensity light and specific sonic frequencies, which made them easy to neutralize once their biology was understood. The early failure in Spain proved that you cannot weaponize a social organism without first becoming its master. The iron logic of the parasite is survival, and it will always prioritize its own replication over the goals of its creators. This period of history was a warning that the pursuit of mind control often leads to the loss of one's own mind, as the line between the host and the parasite begins to blur in the blood. Part 14. Dominant Plaga. Hosts. The dominant species Plaga was the solution designed by Lord Osmond Sadler to fix the failures of the original parasitic outbreaks. By engineering a specific strain of the parasite that allowed the host to maintain their full personality and intelligence while exerting control over the lesser Plaga hosts, Sadler created a literal hierarchy of biological power. He was the iron head of the cult, and he used the dominant parasites to recruit powerful allies like Vitores Mendez and Ramon Salazar. On paper, this was the perfect weapon system, a tiered command structure where the leaders were gods and the soldiers were obedient slaves. However, the project failed because the iron of the dominant hosts was ultimately fragile, and the power shifted away from the creators and toward the individuals who held the parasites. The failure of the dominant Plaga system was its reliance on the survival of the alpha units. In a viral outbreak, the loss of a single zombie or even a tyrant does not stop the infection, but in a Plaga system, the death of a dominant host creates a massive vacuum of control. When Leon S. Kennedy began to dismantle the Los Illuminados' leadership, the entire infrastructure of the cult began to collapse. The sorrow of the dominant hosts was their own arrogance. They believed that the parasite made them invincible, but it actually made them high-value targets with specific biological weaknesses. Sadler himself was the ultimate failure, because despite his massive power and his ability to mutate into a giant arachnid creature, he was still vulnerable to conventional heavy weaponry. The dominant hosts also proved that the parasite does not grant true loyalty. The internal rivalries between Sadler Salazar and the mercenary Jack Krauser showed that the iron grip of the Plaga could not prevent human greed and ambition from ruining the project. The cult was destroyed not just by an outside agent, but by the inherent instability of its own leadership. The dominant Plaga project was a failure because it tried to build a global empire on the back of a parasite that could be killed by a single well-placed rocket. It was a tactical dead end that proved that a centralized brain for a biological army is a fatal flaw that any competent opponent will eventually exploit. Part 15. B.O.W. and Regenerador Programs. The B.O.W. and Regenerador programs were the peak of the Los Illuminados' biological engineering efforts, representing an attempt to create specialized killing machines that could protect the dominant hosts. The B.O.W. was a fusion of human and insectoid DNA, controlled by a dominant Plaga, while the Regenerador was a horrific experiment involving the implantation of multiple parasites into a single human host. These creatures were the iron enforcers of Sadler's Island Fortress, and they were designed to be virtually unkillable by standard military means. The Vertigo possessed incredible speed and armor, while the Regenerador could regrow entire limbs and organs in seconds, making them the stuff of nightmares for any intruder. The failure of these programs was the extreme difficulty of management and the presence of specific biological keys that rendered their defenses useless. The Vertigo, despite its impressive physical stats, was an iron failure because it was highly susceptible to liquid nitrogen, a weapon that can be frozen solid and shattered with a single kick is not a reliable battlefield asset. The Regenerador was even more of a sorrow because its near-infinite regeneration was entirely dependent on the survival of the internal parasites. Once an opponent like Leon Kennedy utilized an infrared thermal scope, the perfect defense of the Regenerador was exposed as a simple game of target practice. The creatures were terrifying, but they were also slow, mindless, and easy to outsmart once their gimmick was revealed. Furthermore, these projects were impossible to scale or deploy in a meaningful way outside of a controlled environment. The cost of creating a single Verdugo was astronomical, and the Regeneradors were so volatile that they had to be kept in cold storage or high-security labs to prevent them from consuming the cult's own resources. They were biological dead ends that focused on a single iron trait like armor or regeneration, while ignoring the necessity of tactical flexibility. The Verdugo and Regenerador programs proved that a perfect killing machine is a failure if its weakness can be bought at a local weapon shop. They were the final desperate experiments of a dying cult, monuments to the belief that raw biological power can overcome a lack of strategic vision. Part 16. G-Virus, William Birkin. The G-Virus project, led by William Birkin, represents the first major departure from the traditional goals of the Umbrella Corporation, and stands as one of the most magnificent failures in the history of biological science. While the T-virus was designed to create manageable weapons, the G-virus was an attempt to trigger a state of constant and infinite evolution. This was the iron dream of William Birkin, a man who wanted to create a god that could adapt to any threat in real time. However, the G-virus was a failure from the very moment of its conception, because it lacked the most basic requirement of any weapon system, which is the preservation of the host identity. When Birkin injected himself with his own creation in the sewers of Raccoon City, he did not become a god. He became a runaway biological reaction. The virus began to rewrite his genetic code at such a violent speed that his physical form could not maintain its structural integrity. This is the ultimate sorrow of the G-virus, where the host is consumed by the very power they sought to control. The failure of the G-virus is most visible in the total loss of purpose. A weapon is designed to strike a specific target, but a G-virus host has no target other than its own survival and replication. As Birkin mutated through his various stages, he lost his intellect, his memories, and his humanity. He became a formless mass of flesh covered in massive unblinking eyes and shifting limbs that served no tactical function. This constant evolution meant that the creature was impossible to lead or utilize in a tactical capacity. It was a biological fire that simply burned until it ran out of fuel. For Umbrella, the G-virus was a disaster because it could not be mass-produced or controlled. It was a localized apocalypse that destroyed the very facility where it was created. The iron logic of Birkin was that survival of the fittest meant whoever could change the fastest. But the G-virus proved that if you change too fast, you eventually become nothing at all. It was a biological dead end that prioritized the survival of the virus over the survival of the species. Furthermore, the G-virus created a unique ecological failure through the production of G-embryos. Unlike the T-virus, which spreads through simple bites and scratches, the G-virus seeks to replicate by forcibly implanting embryos into other living hosts. This led to a horrific series of rejections, where the embryos would tear their way out of incompatible bodies, creating even more mindless and unstable monsters. The sorrow of the G-virus was the trail of mutilated corpses it left in its wake as it searched for a genetic match that did not exist. By the time Birkin reached his final form, he was nothing more than a giant wall of meat and teeth, a creature that could not even move effectively to defend itself. His eventual destruction by Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield on the evacuation train proved that constant evolution is a weakness when it leads to a lack of specialized function. The G virus was a magnificent mistake, a project that proved that without a stable blueprint, life is just a chaotic and self-destructive mess. Part 17. Tige Mutations. The attempt to combine the strengths of the T virus and the G virus resulted in the TG variations, which were intended to be the ultimate synthesis of stability and evolution. Umbrella researchers believed that if they could use the T virus to provide a structural framework, they could then use the G virus to grant the host the power of rapid adaptation and electromagnetic manipulation. This was the iron ambition of the late 90s, where the company felt it could stack different biological disasters on top of each other to create a perfect result. The most famous example of this was the creature known as the T-091, which attempted to merge the Tyrant program with G virus cells. However, this project was a spectacular failure because the two viruses were fundamentally incompatible on a molecular level. Instead of creating a superior soldier, the TG variation created a creature that was trapped in a state of permanent physical agony and cellular rejection. The failure of the TG project was rooted in the biological conflict between the two strains. The T virus seeks to stabilize the host into a specific form, while the G virus seeks to constantly change that form. This resulted in a creature that possessed the massive strength of a tyrant, but with flesh that was soft, fragile, and prone to leaking. The iron of the tyrant armor was replaced by the sorrow of G virus growth that made the creature vulnerable to even standard small arms fire. Tactically, the TG variations were a nightmare because they were too unstable to be deployed and too expensive to maintain. They required specialized containment and constant monitoring to prevent them from melting into a puddle of necrotic sludge. The researchers had ignored the basic laws of biology in their pursuit of power, and they ended up with a project that was a tactical and financial black hole. Additionally, the TG variations proved that stacking viruses does not result in a stacking of benefits, but a stacking of flaws. The creature created for the Atlantic Facility incident was capable of generating a high-voltage electric field, but it could not control the discharge, often causing more damage to its own nervous system than to its enemies. This lack of control made the TG project a biological dead end that was quickly abandoned by the few remaining Umbrella loyalists. It was a failure of corporate arrogance, the belief that if one virus was good, then two must be better. The result was a series of monsters that were too broken to live and too dangerous to ignore. The TG experiments were the final desperate gasps of a dying company, trying to find a shortcut to godhood, but they only found a new and more agonizing way to fail. Part 18. C-Virus Hybrids. The C-Virus project was the crowning achievement of Neo Umbrella and was designed by Carla Radames to trigger a global biological catastrophe that could be managed through a hierarchy of command. By combining elements of the T Veronica virus and the G virus, Carla created a pathogen that could be delivered via aerosol or injection. The resulting Javo were soldiers that retained their human intelligence, their ability to use advanced weaponry, and their tactical coordination. This was the iron dream of the modern bio-terror age, an army of monsters that could operate like a Tier 1 military unit. However, the C-Virus was a failure because the very complexity of its design made it prone to unpredictable and catastrophic mutation chains. When a Javo sustained damage, it would trigger a localized mutation that turned a limb into a shield or a weapon. But if the damage was too great, the entire host would dissolve and reform into a completely different creature. The failure of the C virus was its total loss of logistical control during a mass infection scenario. While a small unit of Javo could be managed a city-wide outbreak, like the ones seen in Edonia or Lanxiang, resulted in a sea of chaotic and competing mutations. The iron discipline of the Neo-Umbrella Army was quickly replaced by the sorrow of a global plague that destroyed the very infrastructure Kala needed to rule. The virus also produced the chrysalid state, where hosts would encase themselves in a hard shell before emerging as massive specialized monsters. These creatures were powerful, but they were entirely independent and often ignored their own commanders. The C virus proved that mass infection does not equal control. It equals a global noise that drowns out the voice of the creator. Furthermore, the C virus was fueled by the personal revenge and psychological instability of Kala Radames, which meant that the project had no sustainable goal other than the destruction of the status quo. When Kala was killed, the entire Neo-Umbrella structure collapsed because there was no one left to provide the iron direction required to manage the millions of infected hosts. The C virus army was defeated by the BSAA, not just through superior firepower, but through the inherent flaws in a virus that prioritizes mutation over stability. The project was a failure because it tried to weaponize chaos. And as Umbrella had learned decades prior, chaos cannot be led. The C virus left behind a world in ruins and a legacy of biological instability that proved that even the most intelligent designer cannot account for the sheer unpredictability of life when it is pushed to the edge of extinction. Part 19. Ouroboros Project. The Ouroboros Project was Albert Wesker's final attempt to rewrite the human story through a process of selective evolution. Using a highly refined and tamed strain of the Progenitor Virus, Wesker created Ouroboros to act as a judge for the human race. The iron logic of the project was that only those with the proper genetic markers would be allowed to evolve into a superior state, while the rest of humanity would be consumed and replaced by the black viral tendrils of the virus. This was the peak of Wesker's God complex, a plan to burn the world down and walk out of the ashes as the leader of a new race. However, Ouroboros was a colossal failure because its requirements for a compatible host were so extreme that it would have resulted in the extinction of 99% of the human species. A world with only a handful of gods is not a civilization. It is a graveyard. The failure of Ouroboros was also visible in its physical manifestations during the Kijuju incident. When the virus encountered an incompatible host, it did not just kill them. It used their biomass to create a sprawling, mindless entity that sought only to consume more organic matter. These Ouroboros masses were incredibly powerful and resistant to most conventional weapons, but they were also slow and vulnerable to high-intensity heat and fire. The iron of Wesker's vision was undermined by the sorrow of a virus that was too hungry for its own good. If the virus had been released on a global scale, as Wesker intended, it would have created a planet covered in black sludge with no one left to build the infrastructure or the culture of his new world. It was a logistical and biological dead end that ignored the necessity of a supporting population. Wesker himself was the final proof of the project's failure. When he was forced to bond with the virus during his confrontation with Chris Redfield, he became a monster that was driven by rage rather than intellect. The god of the new world was defeated by a pair of agents and a volcano, proving that even the most advanced evolutionary jump is no match for a dedicated human spirit. The Ouroboros project was a failure of scale and a failure of empathy. Wesker had focused so much on the iron of the individual that he forgot that a species is more than just its strongest member. His death marked the end of the Spencer era and the realization that selective evolution is just a fancy name for suicide. Ouroboros was the ultimate biological mistake, a project that sought to save the world by making it uninhabitable. Part 20. Neo Umbrella, B.O.W. The collapse of Neo Umbrella and the subsequent failure of their biological weapon programs marked the end of the era of large-scale corporate bioterror. Under the leadership of Carla Radames, the organization had attempted to use the C virus to enforce a new global order based on fear and mutation. Their iron ideology was that the world was too broken to be saved, and that a biological reset was the only answer. However, they failed because they lacked the logistical and financial support that the original Umbrella Corporation had spent decades building. Neo Umbrella was an organization of shadows and fanatics, and they were unable to maintain the high level of security and containment required for their own experiments. The sorrow of their collapse was the sudden and violent end of thousands of researchers who were consumed by the very monsters they were trying to perfect. The primary failure of the Neo Umbrella B.O.W. was their reliance on the personal direction of a single, unstable leader. When Carla Radames was eliminated, the entire organization lost its sense of purpose, and the C virus army became a disorganized mob. This highlighted a fundamental flaw in the corporate arrogance of the modern era: the belief that an ideology can replace a proper military command structure. The Javo and the specialized monsters they created were effective in the short term, but they could not hold territory or manage a civilian population. They were weapons of terror, not weapons of war. Once the BSAA coordinated their efforts, the Neo Umbrella facilities were quickly neutralized, and the project was exposed as a desperate act of revenge rather than a viable political movement. Furthermore, Neo Umbrella failed to solve the problem of viral containment during field testing. Their decision to test the C virus on live cities like Lanxiang resulted in a global backlash that unified every major power against them. This arrogance led to their eventual downfall as they were hunted to the edge of the earth. The failure of Neo Umbrella was the final proof that bioterror for profit or for ideology is a self-destructive cycle. They had inherited all of the iron ambition of Oswell E. Spencer, but none of his patience or his resources. Their legacy is a world that is permanently on edge, a world where the name Umbrella still triggers a deep biological fear. The collapse of the organization was the final verdict on the corporate era of B.O.W. development, proving that if you build a company on a foundation of monsters, you will eventually be eaten by the things you created. Part 21. Mold Experiments and the E-Series. The shift from viral engineering to mycological research represented a new and terrifying chapter in the history of biological weaponry, specifically through the development of the mold and the E-Series experiments. Unlike the T virus, which sought to destroy or mutate the host, the mold was designed to integrate with the host nervous system to achieve a state of total mental and physical control. The iron ambition of the organization known as the Connections was to create a weapon that could conquer an entire population without firing a single bullet by utilizing a centralized commander to project a telepathic signal. The result was the E-Series, specifically the subject known as Eveline, who possessed the ability to secrete the mold and use it to infect and dominate the minds of anyone in her vicinity. However, the E-Series was a spectacular failure, because the biological cost of such absolute control resulted in a host that was mentally and physically unstable and prone to rapid cellular degradation. The primary failure of the Eveline project was the rapid and uncontrollable aging of the host body, because the mold required a massive amount of cellular energy to maintain the mental link with its victims and to generate the fungal biomass known as the molded. The body of the young girl was subjected to extreme metabolic stress that the human genome was never meant to endure. Within a matter of a few years, the child subject had aged into an elderly woman, losing the physical mobility and the cognitive focus required to lead an army in the field. This was the sorrow of the E-series, where a project designed for global conquest became a localized tragedy, trapped in a dilapidated farmhouse in the bayous of Louisiana. Evelyn herself began to lose her sanity as her body decayed, becoming obsessed with the concept of a family rather than the strategic goals of her corporate creators. This emotional instability caused the mold to react in violent and unpredictable ways, turning the infected Baker family into a collection of horrific and uncontrollable monsters, rather than a cohesive and disciplined military unit. Furthermore, the mold proved that absolute control traded for autonomy is a tactical weakness in any modern combat scenario. The molded creatures, created by Evelyn, were mindless and lacked the tactical intelligence required for complex warfare or urban occupation. They were effective at defending a single location through sheer brute force, but they could not be used to capture a city or manage a complex infrastructure because they lacked any form of self-preservation or strategic reasoning. The project was a biological dead end because it relied entirely on a single centralized host who was dying from her own power. When the BSAA and Ethan Winters intervened, the entire E-series network collapsed almost instantly, proving that a mind control weapon is only as strong as the brain at the center of the web. The mold experiments showed that even when you move away from the chaotic mutations of the T virus, the pursuit of absolute control over the human will always leads to a biological and psychological breakdown that cannot be fixed with science. Part 22. Bioterror for Profit. The era following the collapse of the original Umbrella Corporation saw the rise of a decentralized black market for biological weapons, where profit was prioritized over containment and safety. Every private buyer, from the South American drug lord Javier Hidalgo to the disgruntled researcher Glenn Arias, sought to use the remnants of Umbrella research to further their own personal or political agendas. The iron logic of these buyers was that a virus could be bought and managed, just like any other military asset. But they all failed to realize that when you weaponize a pathogen, you lose control of the supply chain the moment it enters the field. The history of this era is a record of corporate arrogance and greed that led to dozens of localized outbreaks which were impossible to contain through conventional means. The sorrow of the profit-driven era was the realization that a virus does not care about a balance sheet or a business contract, and it will always find a way to infect the hand that holds the money. The primary failure of bioterror for profit was the lack of a centralized and professional security infrastructure to manage the volatility of the research. While Umbrella had the vast resources to build massive underground labs and private armies to guard their secrets, the smaller private buyers often conducted their research in substandard facilities with minimal safety protocols. This led to a series of accidental leaks and intentional releases that devastated entire regions and exposed the buyers to international prosecution. Javier Hidalgo, for example, attempted to use the T. Veronica virus to save his dying daughter, but he lacked the iron discipline of Alexia Ashford, and he ended up turning his entire estate and the surrounding ecosystem into a biological wasteland. He proved that even with a massive fortune, you cannot buy the ability to control a force of nature that was designed to be uncontrollable. The market for biological weapons became a race to the bottom, where the cheapest and most volatile products were the ones most likely to be deployed in a crisis. Furthermore, the commercialization of bioweapons meant that the secrets of the Progenitor Virus were no longer in the hands of a few aristocrats, but were being traded between rival cartels and terrorist cells across the globe. This created a global noise of infection that the international community and the BSAA were completely unprepared to handle. The failure of these private ventures was their extreme short-sightedness. They wanted the immediate power of the virus without the long-term responsibility of the cure or the containment. This arrogance led to their eventual exposure and destruction as the global intelligence network began to track the money trail back to the corporate and criminal sources. The era of bioterror for profit was a failure because it treated a global extinction threat as a simple commodity, resulting in a world where everyone was a target and no one was safe. It proved that when you turn a monster into a product, you eventually find that there is no market for a dead planet and no profit in a graveyard. Part 23. Field testing on live cities. Throughout the history of the Umbrella Corporation and its various successors, there was a recurring and horrific decision to treat civilian populations as expected loss variables for the sake of gathering combat data. From the streets of Raccoon City to the villages of Kijuju and the metropolitan centers of China, the iron arrogance of the creators led them to believe that the only way to prove the worth of a bioorganic weapon was to test it in a live urban environment. They viewed these cities not as collections of human lives, but as petri dishes where the efficiency of the T virus, the G virus and the C virus could be measured in real time against an unprepared population. This was a catastrophic failure of ethics and a strategic blunder of the highest order, because every live test eventually led to the exposure and downfall of the organization behind the outbreak. The failure of a field testing on live cities was the complete unpredictability of a civilian environment and the rapid loss of containment. While a laboratory is a controlled space with airlocks and decontamination protocols, a city is a chaotic system of millions of variables. In Raccoon City, Umbrella hoped to gather data on the Tyrant and the Nemesis, but they quickly found that they could not contain the viral spread through the water supply and the local wildlife. The sorrow of the city was that the very success of the virus in killing the population also destroyed the infrastructure and the secrecy that Umbrella needed to survive. The data they gathered was paid for with the total destruction of their own regional headquarters and the permanent loss of their public mask. They had focused on the iron of the combat results while ignoring the political and social consequences of a mass murder on that scale, which eventually unified the world against them. Furthermore, every live field test acted as a catalyst for the global community to unite and create powerful countermeasures. The horror of seeing a city like Lanxiang consumed by the C virus gave the BSAA and other international agencies the political mandate and the massive funding they needed to dismantle Neo-Umbrella once and for all. The arrogance of the creators made them believe they were untouchable gods who could play with the lives of millions, but they were actually painting a massive target on their own backs. They proved that field testing on a civilian population is a self-defeating strategy, because a weapon that is too effective at killing innocents is also effective at attracting the attention of every hero and army on the planet. This was the final and most costly failure of the corporate era, the belief that they could treat the entire world as a laboratory without eventually being held accountable by the survivors and the ghosts of the cities they destroyed. Part 24. Why biological weapons always fail. As we analyze the long and bloody history of these projects, we must confront the final verdict on why every bioorganic weapon ever created has ultimately resulted in failure. The core of this failure is the fundamental paradox between control and evolution that no amount of science has been able to bridge. The iron goal of a weapon designer is to create an instrument that follows orders with absolute precision and maintains its tactical form. But the goal of biological evolution is to adapt, survive, and overcome any constraint. You cannot force a creature to undergo a violent viral mutation while simultaneously demanding that it maintain its human loyalty or its tactical discipline. The T virus, the G virus, and the Las Plagas all illustrate this inherent conflict. The more power you grant a host to destroy its enemies, the less control you have over its mind and its ultimate purpose. This is the biological iron rule that Umbrella and its successors could never break. Another primary reason for God through tactical ingenuity and cooperation. The sorrow of the Umbrella Corporation was the realization that their monsters lab or encoded into a viral strand. Furthermore, biological weapons always fail because they are fundamentally self-destructive. A virus like the C virus or Ouroboros is so efficient at destroying its environment that it eventually runs out of hosts to infect and resources to consume. It is a weapon that burns the house down to kill a single intruder. The cost of maintaining a biological arsenal is astronomical compared to the actual tactical benefits they provide on the battlefield. When you factor in the high risk of accidental leakage and the inevitable global backlash, the return on investment for a bioorganic weapon is always in the negative. Umbrella spent 40 years and billions of dollars to build a world of monsters, and in the end, all they had to show for it was a bankrupt company and a legacy of shame. They failed because they tried to weaponize life itself, and life is a force that refuses to be owned. Part 25. The one thing Umbrella never solved. The one thing that the Umbrella Corporation and its various successors never solved was the inherent unpredictability of the human will and its refusal to be enslaved by biological means. For all their talk of the iron will of the elite and the creation of a new race of gods, they were never able to account for the simple fact that a human being will fight to the death for their freedom and for their identity. From Lisa Trevor to Albert Wesker, every subject of their experiments eventually reached a point where they rebelled against their creators. Whether it was through a loss of sanity, a pursuit of personal power, or a desire for revenge, the human element always managed to sabotage the corporate agenda. This was the final and most significant failure of the Spencer era. The belief that you can strip away a person's humanity and replace it with a virus without creating a monster that will eventually come for your throat. Umbrella failed to solve the problem of autonomy because they viewed the human body as nothing more than a vessel for their science. They ignored the complexity of the human spirit and the power of individual choice. When they created the Wesker children, they believed they were creating the perfect successors, but they actually created their own executioners. Albert Wesker took everything he learned from Spencer and used it to dismantle the very system that birthed him. This is the ultimate irony of the biological age. The more the creators tried to control the future, the more they ensured their own obsolescence. The sorrow of Umbrella is that they built a mirror that showed them exactly what they were: cold, heartless, and ultimately fragile men who were terrified of the very world they tried to master. They could create monsters that could tear a man in half, but they could never create a monster that could truly replace the human heart. The legacy of Umbrella is a world that is permanently scarred by their arrogance, but it is also a world that has learned how to fight back. The existence of the BSAA and the ongoing efforts of survivors to clean up the biological mess left behind are the proof that the human will is stronger than any viral mutation. The one thing Umbrella never solved was the fact that their vision of a new world was one that no one wanted to live in. They were architects of a tomb, and they were surprised when the world refused to lie down and die. As we look at the ruins of their labs and the history of their failures, we see that the true iron of the human race is not found in a viral injection, but in the courage to face the darkness and say no. Umbrella is gone, but the lesson remains. You cannot weaponize the soul, and you cannot build a future on a foundation of monsters.